We rented at first, and we were sick from the day that we moved in. At first, I thought it was just allergies, but it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. It felt like bricks were laying on my head. I took the girls to Waterfront Park to play, and we often went for walks. Just 2 weeks after moving in, the girls had their first episode. We went to play at the park in the morning while it was still cool. Nothing out of the ordinary, but when we got home, my 3-year-old was complaining of a stomach ache, and my 1-year-old was fussy. They wanted water, and they just kept drinking it. I became extremely concerned after the second glass. They'd been drinking water all morning at the park with their water bottle, so this was really strange. Then they started vomiting uncontrollably, and they got very pale. The 3-year-old walked to her bed and fell asleep, and the 1-year-old fell asleep in my arms. This was a red flag for me. No matter how sick my kids are, they've never willingly gone to sleep. I think that other parents know what I'm talking about. These episodes continued to happen sporadically, and the local pediatrician told me it was a virus or something sat in their stomach wrong. I asked every parent that I met if their kids had been sick. Some of them told me that their kids get that all the time and they just sleep it off. I decided that it was likely the house we were living in. So we bought our first home about 1 mile east. What we did not know was that we were moving even closer to what was making us sick. We had another baby girl the same week that we moved. She was born cross-eyed, something that my research has linked to pollution in utero. Our health worsened, and we started getting lesions in our nose that never went away, constant nausea, headaches, and upper respiratory infections. My 1-year-old was on a nebulizer due to constant bronchiolitis. We developed bowel problems. Some of us had diarrhea, others of us severe constipation. The girls' bellies became bloated, and they had rashes and eczema on all parts of their bodies. We were so tired all the time and couldn't sleep at night. I remember my lymph nodes were so swollen I couldn't turn my neck when I was driving to change lanes. And I'm showing pictures of things that happened to us once we moved to the Dalles. It happened to all of us in some form, except for the baby, but she didn't grow. So some of them get a little graphic, but it's really important to know that not one of these things that you see we had before we moved to the Dalles. And as you'll see at the end, we don't have them anymore. We had them at first moving away, but now we don't have any. I kept talking to my mom friends, and I kept hearing about sick kids, but no diagnoses. I'm from the Midwest, and I'm very friendly, so I got to know my community well. It seemed like everyone that I met was sick, had been sick or lost someone to a serious illness. Parkinson's, lupus, MS, every type of cancer you can think of, neurological issues, asthma, skin problems, birth defects, boils with cups of pus that were sometimes black and purple in color. It wasn't good. It felt like it was something out of a movie, like the Aaron Brockovich movie. In October, I met another mother and was telling her about how the girls were having episodes. Her jaw dropped, and she said that her kids were experiencing the same exact symptoms, off and on, of course. She said she took her kids to the ER in Portland, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. I told her that I thought it had to be environmental because I couldn't figure out what else could be causing it. She agreed, and we exchanged numbers. 1 week later, I got a phone call from her saying that she found out about a superfund site that treated railroad ties with creosote. She said that a chemical called naphthalene could kill people at high enough levels, but that was all she knew. I hung up the phone and called everyone I could think of that could help. The EPA told me that they had never heard of creosote before. Poison control didn't seem concerned. Locals just didn't want to talk about it. So I Googled it, like I do everything, and I found another young mother whose son was born with autism. She was also living above the plant and was experiencing migraines and felt that the autism and the migraines were both related to the plant. I went to a meeting with other locals with her where my concerns about health were diminished. They were focused on odor and didn't want to ruffle anyone's feathers. I went home and called news stations and began planning a protest. We brought my husband's daughter from Africa to live with us in February. She began attending Dry Hollow Elementary and coming home early from migraines that developed. She also began experiencing vomiting and nausea, with the only cure being laying in a dark room until it passed. She began getting boils also, something she didn't experience in Africa. We sent her to Mosher for school in the fall, and we never got a single phone call again from the school saying she was sick. And in that map, you can see how close Dry Hollow is to Amerities, so that there's the yellow line, the thick one is 84, the next yellow line is the highway, and then there's the green space is a bluff, so it's just right above that bluff. So very toxic. The two little ones continued experiencing episodes, and they would get worse each time. In the spring, we planted a garden and ate from our fruit trees. This was not a good idea. And that's when things started getting much worse. I called my friend and told her that things were getting bad. When she asked what we were doing differently, I said, we're just eating from our garden. That's, that should be what we're doing right. We're doing something good for our family. We planted a garden. And she said, that's not what you should be doing. You shouldn't eat out of that garden. It's absorbing the soil and the air and the water, all of it's contaminated. So you're getting all of the contamination at once. So I started to research creosote and the health effects, and I was horrified at my findings. Naphthalene is the chemical in creosote that gives it a mothball odor. At high enough levels, it can kill anyone. But for people with a genetic variation called G6PD, they could die when exposed to any amount of naphthalene. This variation is common in people from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. This gene mutates after exposure to the disease malaria and protects you from contracting the malaria again. But at the same time, it makes the body unable to process exposure to certain chemicals, such as ibuprofen, blue food dye, and naphthalene. My husband's from West Africa, and I became very concerned. I went to speak with our pediatrician in Portland and mentioned that I thought our illness were from creosote. He told me that creosote is poison, and he mentioned one chemical that he knew of, arsenic, was also in it. He told me to move right away and recommended a naturopath. I also contacted a G6PD specialist and mentioned to him about it, and he said that naphthalene is for sure a trigger for G6PD and that we should move as soon as possible, not to wait on anybody and not to mess around with it. KGW News brought their cameras and did a story on my family. We started doing weekly protests at the post office and attending meetings with the DEQ. Sharon Ungren and I created the Dalles Air Coalition after meeting Portland activists from Eastside Portland Air Coalition while seeing Aaron Brockovich speak. Sharon's daughter was diagnosed with lupus as an adolescent while living in the Dalles. When she went away for college, she never took a medication again or had another symptom in her life again. Tiffany Woodside joined after we met at a kid's birthday party, and I learned that she was on disability from effects of creosote poisoning. The three of us combined efforts. We have told our story on many news outlets, including Cascadia Times, who did a great extensive series, and the Oregonian, who also did a series called Polluted by Money. And KGW has been with us since the beginning, airing our first story. And I would like to show you coverage from our first story.
found in the air where families live and children play. The KGW investigation finds the company that's the source of it isn't doing anything wrong.
There's something truly wrong there.
And it has the DEQ permits to prove it. KGW's Kylie Boshi has been working with our investigative team on this story.
And Kyle, this plant is operating within legal limits, even though the chemical levels may be unhealthy for residents.
Indeed, the treatment plant in question is called Amerities West. It's right in the heart of the Dalles between I-5 and the Columbia River. It's important to note and to emphasize the company isn't doing anything illegal. The chemicals coming from the plant have a lot of people concerned. Neighbors from the Dalles complain of a strong odor. It comes and goes.
It smells like mothballs. Just like mothballs.
Rachel Najjar smelled it.
Once you smell it, it's just like you're right there because it's so strong and you can't escape it.
Yes, this is my notebook.
So did Christina Cronkright.
Your permits and sampling data.
She's had migraines and felt weak after smelling the strong odor.
It's gotten to the point where we really don't go outside to play unless we leave town.
And they're not alone. Over the years, dozens of neighbors have filed complaints about the smell, and now some worry the health consequences could go far beyond a bad smell.
It's just surreal. The experience has been completely surreal. Like, I never knew anything like this could ever happen in a town.
The odor is coming from the Amerities West treatment plant, right in the heart of town. The company gave us a tour to show how it treats railroad ties, turning them from light to dark using creosote. Creosote is a byproduct of coal tar that contains toxins including naphthalene, the same potentially harmful chemical as in mothballs.
I knew it was creosote right away. Growing up, we walked the railroad tracks, around town.
The company took air samples for 2 days in the Dalles in September 2011 and February 2012 and found levels of naphthalene far above the Oregon Health Authority standards. Despite this, the Oregon DEQ renewed Amerities' permit with no changes in 2015. At the time this permit was issued, was human health a consideration?
No, currently our entire program is based on the Federal Hazardous Air Pollutant Program that's technology-based.
The DEQ is looking to revise its policies after studies showed 2 Portland glass factories were emitting high levels of heavy metals. Just like Amerities, the DEQ issued a permit to those factories. They were operating within the legal limits. Now, DEQ hopes to reevaluate and take health considerations into account when issuing those permits. Would you revisit the Amerities situation?
I can't tell you if we'll revisit the Amerities situation until I know what the rule's going to say, but we could certainly do that, and we could certainly revisit other facilities and sources that would require us to add more conditions to their permit.
For neighbors in the Dalles, a second look can't come soon enough. They worry about that smell and the impact it may have on their families.
You can control what you eat, but you can't control what's in your air and what you're breathing every day.
The plant manager at Amerities says he's not worried about the health effects. He lives in the Dalles. In fact, he says he uses those railroad ties for landscaping in his yard. Back to you.
Thank you, Kyle. There's much more to his story. Read.
Okay. So not long after that, my husband took a traveling job for work and we moved around the country trying to decide what to do next. Many of our symptoms went away, but some of them worsened. I consulted with the naturopath that our pediatrician referred us to, and she said that many symptoms would get worse as we detoxed. And that's actually what we wanted because we wanted to get out the chemicals, but they're gonna come through the skin. And so that's why we have these horrible rashes and boils everywhere. So even though we were in pain, the boils and rashes were a sign that our body was working to get rid of the chemical waste that it was fighting. And so we welcomed it. We moved around more and more, and my life became dedicated to healing my family. If I wasn't helping one of the kids drain a boil, I was tending to a migraine or rashes that wouldn't stop itching or somebody that couldn't breathe. But eventually things calmed down. until I started doing some juice cleanses for detoxing myself. One day, while doing a juice cleanse, I put a rag on something that felt like a boil that was developing. When I woke up, I found this yellow tar substance that you can see on the rag there, and it had come out of the area that was hurting. I knew that this was creosote because it's the same yellow film that I would peel off of my windows when I lived in the Dalles. So that's pretty gross. And we moved back to Hood River in the fall of 2017 to help fight for the Dalles. It was there that I became increasingly concerned about other environmental issues in the gorge. Pesticides, oil trains, uncovered coal trains, Hanford, hazardous waste landfills, and hazardous treatment facilities, among many others. The wood treatment plant opened up in 1922. Let's see here. One second. We got a few more minor skin rashes and boils upon returning to Oregon, but eventually they did heal. So you can see they're just not as bad. The baby finally grew after we moved from the Dalles. She wasn't growing. And we had pretty big babies, so it was pretty obvious. But I knew that her symptoms would present differently than our other kids because she didn't have any when we lived there. Her growth caught up when we moved, but she has been in speech therapy and chiropractic care for over a year. This is 3 of my kids, all at age 1. You can see that my baby on the right, the youngest one at this time, she's a lot smaller than the other kids were. We're thankful to have our health in our lives, but our bodies are forever changed after living in the Dalles for only 1 year. We're extremely sensitive to any chemicals, odors, and preservatives in foods. We've had a great success with natural medicine and healing, and we'll continue to follow their advice. Here's the last protest that I held in the Dalles the week before I left town. We held this sign over I-84 and walked across to the entrance of Amerities and held them as the workers left work. I'm not able to go into the city of the Dalles anymore, as immediately upon crossing city lines, I have symptoms again. I knew nothing about pollution, and I honestly didn't think about protecting the environment all that much before this, which I'm ashamed to say because it's so important. But I do know that the Dalles has become a sacrifice zone where generations of authorities and politicians have prostituted the city of the Dalles out to industry. Now, we know this because there are 7 superfund sites in the Dalles. A superfund site is land that has become so contaminated that it's beyond repair, posing a threat to the environment and the community. Typically, these businesses are closed down, abandoned, and the government has to fight the owner to fund cleanup. The operating business has changed so many times, finding the sole responsible party for the damage and enforcing it is impossible. But the owner of the land is the railroad giant Union Pacific, and they have taken on the financial burden of cleaning up this site. What's interesting is that while most Superfund sites are closed down and the land is repurposed, this site, although ownership has changed numerous times, remains open. Here's a table from the EPA website on the left-hand side. As you can see, the last objective says site ready for reuse and development and redevelopment. And it says after that, not yet achieved. Also on the EPA website is a list of Superfund sites and reuse in Oregon. And I just put a piece of it on the right-hand side there. It says that Amerities is still currently operating a wood treatment facility on site, along with another on-site business. Another website lists this business that they're talking about as Tronics, which is a chemical company that spun off of Kerr-McGee. I have contacted the EPA and DEQ and neither have any kind of information or permit on Tronics. Amerities manager informed me that he has never heard of Tronics before. Now, not only does the Superfund site remain open, but they still serve the same customers, the owner of the land, Union Pacific. You would think that operating an active Superfund site would require strict regulations. Here's the history behind how this happened. The wood treatment plant opened in 1922. In 1937, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built a pipeline in which untreated creosote waste from the plant flowed directly into the Columbia River and surrounding waterfront park. In 1954, the plant began treating ties with pentachlorophenol, or PCP, and ammoniococcal copper arsenate with a coal tar creosote blend. After getting many reports of oil sheens in the river, the U.S. Army Corps plugged the pipe with concrete in 1972, and they called it good. In 1980, creosote was banned due to the health risks that it posed. Of course, the railroad, now this is important to hear, but the railroad lobbied for a hardship exemption and they won. Since there's no safe way to use creosote and we know that there's no safe level, the EPA should have done a health assessment on every town that had creosote contamination, but they didn't. Instead, they put the burden on each state. In 1984, the area with the highest level of contamination, Riverfront Park, was donated to the city of the Dalles by Union Pacific, along with a $10,000 payout in exchange for no responsibility related to cleaning up contaminants. This is around the same time that the EPA began inspecting the plant for contaminants. Now, this same year, the plant was the first industrial waste facility in the state to be awarded OSHA Gold Star status. This exempted them from many things, but most importantly, they would no longer need inspections. In 1987, a new owner took over, Kerr-McGee. Of course, Union Pacific retained ownership of the land. In 1990, the site was added to the National Priorities list of Superfund sites, and operations continued as normal. It's currently number 5 on that list. Most Superfund sites are closed down, remediated, and repurposed. This is overseen by the EPA, typically. But the EPA transferred oversight to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. To this day, Oregon does not have any laws against polluters that are protective of human health. There is no consistent air monitoring, no pollution controls that are confirmed to be functioning, and all emissions are self-reported. So basically, nothing's changed since they were labeled as a Superfund site, which is very troubling. I have been asking Oregon DEQ for an ingredient list for 5 years, and the only thing that they can tell me is that they don't have to disclose them being Amerities. In 1994, UP found widespread contamination of the river sediments, and they put a cap of gravel and riprap on the sediment and called it good again. This is not a solution, and erosion was not considered in this construction, nor was monitoring. It is assumed that the cap is degrading, which is one way that the plant is still contaminating the Columbia River. The second way is creosote that is leached into the groundwater after a century worth of reckless operations, flooding, and spillage. And you can see in this map I have where the plant is, the blue part's the Columbia River, of course, and then the different circles are where they made the gravel and riprap cap. The little circles are Riverfront Park. What they did was they dug out soil and just put new soil on top. But again, that was 30 years ago. Now, the leaching into the groundwater. This has resulted in a growing plume of DNAPL, which is the technical term for creosote sludge that has seeped into the groundwater. It's increasing in size every day as operations continue. A plume is contaminated groundwater, or that word I used before, DNAPL, that is in an aquifer. The plume in the Dalles is still growing and has likely saturated the aquifer all the way to the Columbia River. As the plume increases, DEQ is decreasing monitoring. In fact, they did a visual test of the well last for dioxin, and they said they didn't see any dioxin, so they called it good. And you can't see dioxin. The DEQ's motto is, if they don't test it, it's not poison, right? And on this slide I have in the top right corner, I have the Lone Pine Well. It's just the smallest circle in the top right corner. Let's see if I can circle it for you. Right here. And the plant is over here. So the contamination from the plume, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because it's been there for 100 years. So it's just going to keep getting bigger. And let's see. Oh, it's not letting me move my slides here. There we go. The plume of DNAPL has caused extensive contamination to the groundwater, which contains a well that I showed you, which is a backup supply for the city's drinking water. There are 13,000 residents that are drinking this water. With Google using the city's water supply, backup wells are being used more. Documents have shown us that plans to clean up groundwater don't work and are impossible to achieve. The last testing of that well, which is called the Lone Pine Well, was a visual test that DEQ performed to look for dioxin. Lone Pine is this little box. Oh, I skipped ahead here. Lone Pine is that little box that I drew in the top right. Dioxin is the worst chemical known to man. The Thai plant used PCP for 34 years, which is a pesticide that contains high levels of dioxin, arsenic, and naphthalene, among other chemicals. In 2002, the EPA worked with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission to test the fish in the Columbia River. They found that these fish are contaminated with 7 types of dioxin, among 91 other types of toxic chemicals, many of the same ones that are found in creosote. We're exposed to these chemicals every time we eat fish from the river or swim in it. It is also important to consider that this is just one source of pollution found in the Columbia. 4 Indian nations in the Columbia Basin are asking Oregon DEQ to investigate dioxin contamination from the Thai plant. So we hope that happens. In 2002, Kerr-McGee considered closing down their plant in the Dalles. The other 4 forest product treatment facilities owned by Kerr-McGee closed and were compensated by the nation's largest environmental lawsuit in history. Columbus, Mississippi, Madison, Illinois, and Springfield, Missouri planned to close by the end of 2003. Kerr-McGee also planned to close the Thai plant in Texarkana, Texas by the end of 2004. Instead of the Dalles location being closed, compensated, and a community health assessment done as it should have been, they sold the business to Amerities Holdings LLC, founded by Warren Nelson. Amerities was founded in 2003 when it purchased assets from Kerr-McGee. So it's essentially Kerr-McGee. The only assets that they have left in the wood treating business, oh, it's important to say that Kerr-McGee was who was operating the plant when it was declared a Superfund site. Now they have spun off into different, let's see, undo. They've spun off into different names, and that is why they're still going. The only assets that were left in the wood treating business at this time was the Thai plant and the Dalles. And to make matters worse, the lawsuit excluded the Dalles and instead another Thai plant that had been closed since 1955 in Manville, New Jersey, received payment to upgrade their water supply, even though the EPA said that it would never meet federal regulations, because we know that you can never get creosote out of water. We've reached out to Wasco County Health Department, who simply tells us that they believe the plan is safe if DEQ says it is. In the past, there was actually an effort to remove the local health department. Historically, there has been a lack of reporting rates of diseases from Wasco County, in spite of the fact that there's a thriving state-of-the-art cancer center and 3 dialysis clinics that are full and busy. Many people don't trust the local healthcare and seek outside providers, so this also doesn't give us an accurate rate of disease. The mayor, state representatives, and other city leaders all have the same stance. State representatives have campaign donations from Union Pacific and have taken jobs at local healthcare facilities like MCMC and One Community Health, handling finances and contributions. The Oregonian did a series on why our local government isn't protecting us from industrial pollution, and I'd like to show just a few clips from an interview on KGW with the journalist that I worked with, Rob Davis.
Welcome back to Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. Many Oregonians like to think of the state as environmentally friendly, a green state. But in reality, that might not be the case. In a 4-part series, Polluted by Money, the Oregonian examined the effect of unlimited campaign contributions and corporate cash on the state's environmental policies. And it found Oregon is coming up short when it comes to protecting the environment and citizens' health. Here to tell us more, welcome to my guest, the Oregonian reporter behind this investigation, Rob Davis. Rob, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
This was really an eye-opening investigation. What went into this investigation?
About 18 months of work, exclusively digging into our regulatory agencies, lawmakers. We got tens of thousands of pages of documents from regulators, and then we looked very deeply at who's giving, who's getting money, and how they're spending it.
I want to read the powerful paragraph that kicks off your investigation. Oregon once aimed to be the greenest state in America. Its leaders adopted the nation's first bottle deposit. They controlled urban sprawl. They declared ocean beaches public property. But in the last 4 years, Oregon's most powerful industries have killed, weakened, or stalled efforts to deal with climate change, wolf recovery, disappearing bird habitat, cancer-causing diesel exhaust, dwindling groundwater, industrial air pollution, oil spill planning, and weed killers sprayed from helicopters. What changed Oregon? Money. Lots and lots of money. Rob, how?
And then there's another one at 7:24.
This time around, another example in the Dalles, and you did a whole report on this, looking at pollution in the Dalles and the stench from a railroad tie plant that emits an odor that smells like mothballs. The current owner is Amerities, and it uses creosote to treat the ties, which is completely legal, but you found the pollutant drove 20 people to leave their homes. And KGW did an investigation in 2016. When we talked with resident Christina Cronkrite, whose son was 4 years old at the time, they lived above the plant, and she said the smell gave her migraines and made her feel weak. Let's listen to what she said.
It's gotten to the point where we really don't go outside to play unless we leave town. It's just surreal. The experience has been completely surreal. Like, I never knew anything like this could ever happen in a town.
How has the DEQ allowed this to persist?
It's really interesting. After that story ran on KGW, we got records showing how one lawmaker, Representative John Huffman, a Republican who represented the Dalles, 59% of the money that he raised in his career came from corporations. Just a few $1,000 from town residents and small donors. And he intervened with the Department of Environmental Quality, with the governor's office, saying that the issues that you all raised in that story, really weren't that big of a deal. And, really the DEQ should take it easy on that company. And they did. They excluded the public from negotiations about a deal to fix it. And he's a guy who'd taken money from the railroad who intervened on its behalf.
And what's the situation now? Has it changed?
The day that we published a story about it, the Department of Environmental Quality announced that it was going to be cracking down on air pollution from the plant and potentially doing things that it could have done 3, 4, 5 years ago.
We'll talk a little bit more about reaction to your story in a moment. How much pressure are Oregon lawmakers under to raise all this cash?
There is an absolute arms race for competitive seats. Seats for the House of Representatives, every 2 years, folks run competitive races now upwards of $1 million. So lawmakers we talked to said, the day that the session ends, people are saying, when is your first fundraiser going to be?
Governor Brown's talking about campaign finance reform. It's always been in this state struck down by the courts as a matter of free speech. Do you think we're going to see campaign finance reform? Other states have managed to do it.
We're keeping a really close eye on that. The legislature could refer a question to voters. They say that they're going to amend the state's constitution to make it legal to limit campaign contributions. They haven't voted to do that yet, and so we're keeping a close eye to see whether they follow through on that.
After doing this report, do you think it would make a difference in the environmental regulations?
Oregon in 1996 limited donations, and they plummeted. The floor came out of it. And so donation limits absolutely can have an effect on the amount of money that's coming into the state political system.
So there's a big problem, a big root of our problem there. And our efforts have yielded many different results, all of which have been disproved because there are no laws in Oregon against polluters. Now they're saying that they're working on one called Cleaner Air Oregon, but we haven't seen this yet. ATSDR recently sent out a report assuring that there was no correlation between the Thai plant and our health problems. This was obviously a blatant lie since the threat was already established when it was declared a superfund site due to the threat to the community's health. For 30 years, this site has been operating as an active superfund site, and the plant itself has been around for close to a century. Like all studies that have been done in the Dalles, they have justified their lies by calculating a risk based on faulty data because they don't have any accurate data. Of course, they have never and never will test actual people's blood and tissues because the results would be horrifying and, of course, incriminating. That is why we have focused on education and awareness, reaching out to any media and any community members and anyone at all that will listen. We're currently launching a new nonprofit to spread awareness of environmental toxins in the gorge. Klean Gorge will strive to protect our community's health and the natural beauty that we call home for generations to come. We will be advocating for environmental justice, especially for our migrant workers, our tribes, and those living in poverty. This includes connecting people who have suffered mental, physical, or socioeconomical loss with environmental destruction with proper resources. We will do whatever we can to prevent further destruction of the gorge, especially our water supply, soil, and air. We will advocate that the precautionary principle be used at all times with polluters to protect everyone. Now, we don't have our website ready, but we do have a Facebook page. So look us up, Klean Gorge, with this logo that you see there. TDAC, the Dalles Air Coalition, is also on Facebook, so like us, we don't have a website right now just because we have so much information. We gotta work on it, and we're all busy moms, but we'll get it. When our websites are ready, we'll be posted on Facebook, but we'll share it around and sign up with an email list, so be on the lookout for that. And Klean Gorge is gonna be working on several health studies including testing people around the gorge for pesticides, and also one related to health as much as we can do in the Dalles for creosote. And now I'm ready to answer anybody's questions. And looks like Anne had a question. She wanted to talk more about Amerities South. So there's Amerities West, which is the plant in the Dalles, and the plant manager engineered another plant in Hope, Arkansas, and they put it in the middle of the country, and the one in the Dalles is in the middle of the town. They put a cover on it, and they also, the plant manager in the Dalles, he created a system where they capture the emissions from the process and they recycle it back into the system. Now, even with those 3 very big controls, they're still getting complaints from neighbors in the country of Arkansas. Also, it's important to note that Arkansas has more regulations than Oregon and for the environment. I was able to get their ingredient list, which was shocking. And it's likely similar to ours, if not the same, but really horrible chemicals that nobody would want to be around. Does anybody else have any questions? You could either come on video and ask, or you could type it into the chat.
We could also unmute people at this point, Rachel.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Good.
You can unmute yourself at this point if you want to be.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you're by railroad track, there's a smell. Is that the same smell as creosote?
That's the same one. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And in the Dalles, it's
the
that times like 100. It's awful. It's like you're just surrounded by it. Yeah. Good
like
question.
a burning rubber kind of smell?
Yeah, and I didn't say that, but in the first house that we lived in, that's what I remember smelling. I was like, why is somebody burning tires? That's just weird. And then once I figured it out, I started realizing that it was off and on, and that it was the same smell, the naphthalene smell, like mothballs. And I think that's why a lot of people, why they've gotten away with it for so long, because people don't know what the smell is. And there's so many polluters in the Dalles. You have the aluminum plant, and so that was closed down around the same time that the tie plant was declared a superfund site. So people were focused on the aluminum plant instead of understanding that there was more than one pollutant that they were being exposed to. And also important to note is that the aluminum plant has reopened also under a different name. It was SAPA, and then it was something else. It's not a smeltering plant anymore, but they were recently fined over $1 million because they had been operating negligently. So, anybody else?
Rachel, I have a question. After all these investigations, Amerities changed their process. I don't smell the creosote as much anymore when I go to the Dalles, but it's still there.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, what I noticed was when I started getting involved in this in 2015, and I don't know if that's when it changed, they started moving to night operations. And they would do it at night when people are asleep or early in the morning. Now, they don't have to disclose that to us because they don't have to disclose anything. But what I'm saying, I guess, is that we can't know anything that they're doing because they don't have to tell us. Now, DEQ asked them, they said, would you please consider addressing this odor? And so they said that they did several things, like they changed the formula, like they've added cherry scent into the formula before to try and mask it, which didn't really help, but it made it smell like chemical cherries. But it's different all the time. It's never the same, but it doesn't mean that you're not being exposed to it. So, you know, creosote disperses sporadically as a gas. It's not just like one uniform disbursement. It goes all over. And so when I talked to soil scientists, they said, we can't take a sample of the soil. It won't be accurate because it's not going to be even in the soil. So you don't know, like one place might not be a lot and then another place will be a hot spot.
Are there?
I just want to address what Peter said, is that while the naphthalene is, I mean, creosote is super complicated. I mean, it's a soup. It's basically, there's no, like, this is the chemical definition of creosote. It has naphthalene and other ingredients in it. Mm-hmm. But as far, this is what I learned from this. I did some of the research with Rachel. But the thing is that the naphthalene is the most obvious, right? Because it smells the worst. But dioxin is odorless. There's other pollutants. The naphthalene sort of highlights it, right? But to me, there's other pollutants too that might not be odorous that are just as toxic.
Perfect.
So I think we need to be like, maybe Rachel could talk a little bit about what is creosote and if what we've learned about where the you know, how they, a little bit about what the supply chain, how they make it and all that. So
yeah, like I said, with the community was focused on odor when I came into the picture, and I honestly could care less about the odor. Like, yes, it was annoying, but honestly, I was grateful for it because I could go inside and protect my kids when I smelt it really bad. In the end, we didn't go outside at all because we learned that it was always off-gassing from a chair or the grass or plants or whatever. You know, it was just constantly. Also, we weren't safe inside. The dust is very toxic. And it sticks to everything. So when we moved, we had to get rid of everything that we owned. Creosote it's so complicated, which gives it success in not being able to trace it very well. And when we're fighting it as an odor, they're saying that it's really hard to test air and trace it to the source. So the source pollutant, it's really hard to do that because, again, there's so many superfund sites and pollutants in the Dalles. But we know that it's combined of over probably 20,000 chemical compounds. We don't know for sure, but it depends on the mixture. So it's basically just like a chemical cocktail. They mix it with fuel oil number 6, making it even more toxic, which is like bottom of the barrel tar sands. And it's just not what you want to be breathing or drinking or eating. And that's what is happening in the Dalles. And Ingrid here asked, how far can the chemicals disperse through the strong winds in the Dalles? Really good question. We don't know exactly, you know, DEQ always tracks the wind patterns, and I don't really want to get into that with them because I just want to address it. I don't want to talk about wind, how far, or when it smells or anything. I just want to talk about how it's killing people and people are sick, and it shouldn't be an operation. It's an active Superfund site. But I have heard people complain that they've smelt it in Lisle. I've heard people complain of it in Rowena. I've heard people complain of it almost to that little town. I'm trying to think of what it's called past the Dalles. I can't think right now. But it can be very far. I mean, it can take it and run with it. And we lived on the bluff and it was worse. We also smelt it at our rental, which was 1 mile west. It was on close to Kelly Avenue, if you know the Dalles. And people on the west side can smell it, Home Depot. It does depend on the wind, but also, like I said, the water supply is contaminated, so people are getting in the water. And I talked to a scientist that told me that as soon as you turn on your sink and the water starts coming out, the particles of contamination are going into your house. So it's so toxic and it's so potent that really nobody's safe in that area. Like I said, I didn't know if we were safe coming back to Oregon or the gorge at all, even though I love the gorge. I love the Dalles, I love the gorge. I didn't know if we were safe, so it's kind of a risk that I was taking. But, you know, I live in Cascade Locks now and I feel pretty safe. You know, we're not, I don't think we'll be safe anywhere, like completely safe, but I just want to get away from creosote. That's what I do know. Ian's asking about a study in Louisiana where they tested the dust in people's houses near the creosote plant. Yeah, they tested people's attic dust and they closed down a school. I think that was Louisiana, because they found such high levels. And I was trying to work with the superintendent in the Dalles to get that tested, but she kept refusing my phone calls after a while. And now I think she's retiring, so we'll see where that goes. But yeah, all the other towns, there was a town in Wyoming, and it was almost the same exact situation as the Dalles. And it was the same because Union Pacific owned the land and they leased it out to J.H. Baxter, which is another chemical company. Now, the residents figured out that that was the reason that they were getting sick, and they complained about it. And they actually closed down, and it was a Superfund site. So instead of putting riprap like they did, they put a cap on the river, they actually rerouted the entire river to avoid this contaminated area. Now let that sink in. And we have done absolutely nothing. We put a cap on it, so it's just sitting there. We also just plugged the cement, or we plugged the pipeline with cement that